Julian, welcome to episode 19. And of course, I have to wish you a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Michael. Have you got any resolutions?
Have I got any resolutions? Of course I've got resolutions. I always start with losing at least 10k, which I won't achieve. Only drinking on 3 nights a week, which we'll be testing. Exercising 12,000 steps a day. So a healthy regime is the order of the day for 2022. What about you, Julian?
Oh, I've got my usual slate of 10 or 15 resolutions, which I monitor every month, and I'm usually pretty good at making my resolutions.
Okay, so you don't do what I do. You repeat them for the previous year, having not achieved them.
There's a theme usually. No, they're different ones, but they usually they follow a thematic pattern.
Okay. Did you reflect on your achievements for the past year? Because I'm going to mention you, Julian, because I decided, well, from a technology perspective, what had I learned? So one was how to do a podcast using Audacity.
Right.
What else did I learn? How to edit movies using iMovies. That's another thing I've learned.
So we're going to do a movie next, then, Michael.
We could.
That sounds exciting.
We could do a movie next. Yeah. So and I always do set myself a chance of learning some new technology. So absolutely.
Okay. Excellent. So what have we got on tonight, then, Michael?
Well, we've got 2 topics. We've got San Francisco, and we've got the vexed issue of tipping. And I give you due warning, Julian. I'm not happy with the American tipping system. But more to come.
Me neither.
Before we go on,
okay.
I have to thank you for my Christmas present. So, listeners, I hope you recall Julian has given me a guide to eating in the States. And I'm going to have to say, Julian, I was somewhat concerned by my daughter's recommendation when she described it like a crack house. Why on earth would I go to Waffle House if it's like a crack house, Julian?
I think you go for the experience, Michael. Something which is new and different. My view is that you don't really go to Waffle House for the food, but the experience, can be quite good. And who wouldn't get excited if you had to bet on which one of the staff members is going to be arrested that night while serving you? That's a good experience. You don't get that at Nando's.
And then the second one, of course, is I think it was daughter B was incorrectly stated that Cracker Barrel was one of my favourites, and her boyfriend who said the all-day breakfast, which I thought was terrible. The only redeeming feature of Cracker Barrel was my wife's desire to do the shopping in the area before you go in the restaurant, which she liked, and she bought a Christmas present.
I'm hoping that next time you're in the US, I've given you some ideas for you to have a more pleasant experience while you're doing your driving across the US.
There was plenty of selection, Julian, and I have to take my hat off. I thought it was very systematically run, and getting your daughter and the daughters and boyfriends to categorise their selections was admirably done. Yeah, it sounded like a quiz show to me. It was well done. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, it wasn't the easiest of assignments. So, San Francisco then, Michael. Tell me, what do you like about San Francisco?
A caveat. It's probably now 18 years since I went to San Francisco. So,
did you say 18 years?
18 years.
So thank goodness. I thought you said 80 years to start with.
Yeah. Not quite visiting the 1906 during the earthquake, Julian, but that's fine. So, initial impressions are it's hilly. So, so for those of us who like walking about when we visit cities, be prepared. It's hilly. And the second thing was, and I think if I'm correct, I went in May time. It's also seemed quite cool compared to certainly I'd moved from LA to San Francisco. The fact that it's on the sea, it's on the bay, so it's not quite what you're going to expect.
Have you heard the Mark Twain quote about San Francisco?
No, but go on, you're going to tell me.
The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco. Yeah,
well, I can get that. And it's a place where you have to wear a jumper. I mean, sort of, you go there thinking, oh, it's summer, I'll need T-shirts, but it's chilly.
Yeah, it's set on a peninsula, so you've got water on 3 sides. And as I understand it, you have the cold air from the Pacific and the bay, which are meeting the warm air, and that causes the fog. That's why usually in a morning in San Francisco, it starts off foggy. Then the sun burns that off. You might have a reasonable afternoon, and then it becomes foggy again. So as my grandmother would say, make sure you take layers.
Yes.
And it is not the place you go for a California beach holiday. That would be down south. It can be very cold. First time we went to San Francisco, I think we had tacked it on to a trip. We'd just been in Mexico for a month, and we'd just taken shorts and T-shirts. And then we went up the Californian coast, and it was all very nice. And we got to San Francisco, and we had to buy some more clothes. It just was cold.
So we agreed on that. Oh, by the way, you mentioned the fog. Do you know what the locals call the fog?
Oh, I don't think I do know that.
You ready for this? Carl.
Mm-hmm.
Carl? Yeah, as in the name, Carl. And there's a great debate as to...
With a C or with a K?
With a K. And there's a great debate...
Why do they call it Carl?
Well, people don't know. There's a great debate as to whether it was from some sort of movie, but apparently the locals call it Carl.
Okay, I did not know that. Okay.
So you asked me what I liked about it. It's relatively small, so despite what I said about it being hilly, you can walk around.
Yes.
And I'm going to say it seems to have history to it, in the sense that you've got the cable cars, you've got Alcatraz, you've got the Golden Gate Bridge, you've got the ferry building and Fisherman's Wharf, and is it Pier 39? It's got a vibe to it in the sense that I think it is a tourist town. I remember the time I went, we'd flown, and as you probably appreciate, by the time you get to San Francisco, you'll get there sort of mid-afternoon, have been travelling basically all the day. So you're quite tired. So I remember we went and sort of sat in Union Square. I think we had lunch at the Cheesecake Factory.
Yeah, there is a restaurant called Cheesecake Factory.
And you can watch the world go by. So, it's definitely one of the... And I think you hinted earlier, it's good for people watching. It's a good place. So I liked it. And it is a touristy town.
There's plenty of things for a tourist to do. What did you enjoy in particular, apart from sitting and people watching in Union Square?
I enjoyed going to Alcatraz. Did you know what Alcatraz was before it was a prison, Julian?
I probably did know it because I also have been to Alcatraz, and it's a fantastic thing. What was it before it was a prison? Remind me.
It was a fort. Originally, it was a fort. And actually, again, it's one of those things. And obviously, things may have changed, but the guided tour was very good, very knowledgeable, and you get a good sense of what it was like. And by the way, you admire anybody who could swim to land because it's a long way out.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not at all clear that any prisoners have, in fact, swum to land, but it is claimed that some have. And I believe that there is an annual swim through the bay where people do swim. I imagine that's under very good conditions. I would heartily recommend to anyone going to San Francisco, and I'm assuming that it's not happening now due to COVID, but when COVID finally leaves us, definitely make sure you go to Alcatraz. And in the past, it is something you have to book up, a month or so in advance. So don't book it up once you get there because it'll be difficult for you to find a slot. Make sure you do that. You book a slot before you go. And I think the guided tour is excellent. And I think they really do a good job of explaining, what conditions were like in that prison before it was closed midway through last century.
And where else would you recommend people to go, Julian?
I concur with some of the things you mentioned. So the things that I love in San Francisco. So Alcatraz, I enjoy traveling on the cable cars, which are kind of like tram type things, which take you up and down the 7 hills in which San Francisco is set. I was very fortunate the time before last time that I went, a friend of mine flew me over San Francisco on her plane. That was just terrific. We went over the bay, we went over the bridge, and then we went down the coast. And that really was a fantastic thing to do.
So you've just thrown that in. A friend of mine flew me around on her plane. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very good, Julian.
Well, a lot of them have planes there because it obviously is the home of all of the Silicon Valley types. So, quite a few of them.
Was it a big plane or was it a little plane?
Oh, it was a little plane.
Okay.
It was, 4-person plane. It was lovely. A really good experience. Yeah. Another good experience, kayaking in the bay. The San Francisco Bay is a terrific thing. I haven't done sailing there. I imagine that would also be a wonderful thing to do. Walking across the Golden Gate Bridge or cycling across the Golden Gate Bridge to Marin County, you see what a marvellous feat of engineering that bridge is. Golden Gate Bridge.
And did you know it wasn't originally called the Golden Gate Bridge, was it? The Black and Gold Bridge.
The Black and Gold Bridge.
The Black and Gold Bridge, it was called originally.
Doing that is a good thing. There are a couple of things to do in Marin County as well. So there's a nice little town called Mill Valley, which is kind of one of the first towns as you go into Marin County. And there are the Muir Woods as well that you can take a walk in. You and I are big fans of baseball. They have one of the best views in baseball from Oracle Park. San Francisco Giants play baseball there, and you have great views.
And I think, Julian, when I went, they were in their previous home. Now, was that?
Oh, it could well be. Yes, that's right.
Was that Candlestick Park or something like that? But again, you still had good views of the bay. I got it right?
They keep changing the name of the stadium depending on who's sponsoring it. So I think the current sponsors are Oracle. So it's now called Oracle Park, and it's a marvelous view. And if you like baseball, or if you're going to give baseball a go, see what it's like, that will be a good place to do it, I think.
And before you move on, Julian, what I would say when we went is, I like the baseball experience, but what I recall going on public transport to the ground, and the atmosphere of the people on the bus was great. You really felt you were going into an occasion. There was lots of excitement, lots of banter, a really good vibe. And beautiful, it was in this occasion, it was a spring evening, relatively early in the season, but it was really good fun, good to do.
And I like the architecture. As I think you referenced earlier, there was a big earthquake in 1906. San Francisco actually started life as a village during the gold rush in around 1850. So it was kind of the place that the gold miners would go to get their services.
Do you know, Julian, what was the tipping point from it being small gold rush town to the place, well, not quite known today, but what it built its reputation on? What arrived there in 1869, Julian? And remember, it's me asking you the question.
Well, I'm guessing that you're talking about some train or other.
The railroad arrived.
Am I right?
Yes.
The railroad arrived.
And apparently the railroad had a terrible impact because it wasn't particularly a nice place. It was your classic gold rush town, so full of miners, murders, and brothels. Yes.
It was almost all men. To start with, most of the people who went out on the gold rush were men, and there were a few women who were taken out as well, but most of the original people there were men. And it used to, in sort of 1849 to 1853, it would take about 4 to 6 months to get to the West Coast, to get to the gold. The railroad coming, really that made the huge difference in bringing the whole of the US continent together. That's good. I'm glad you got your train reference in.
Good.
But I like the architecture of San Francisco. Obviously, a lot of it was destroyed in 1906 after the earthquake. But there's a lot of Edwardian type houses, very pretty structures that, line the various different hills in San Francisco. And indeed, the third time we went there, we went with the children. We had rented I think it was a Mustang, an open-top Mustang, and we'd driven up the coast from LA. We'd rented that car very specifically because it was the only one that would fit into the garage of the Airbnb that we'd rented. So, and when I said it fitted in, but once the car was in the garage, you couldn't get out of the car, you couldn't open the doors because the garage was so narrow. And I rented an open-top car because that's the only way I could park the car in the garage and then get out of the car, because there was no roof.
So you didn't think about hiring a Fiat 500 then?
It was sadly before the new Fiat 500. So, it had to be something that I could, which had no roof.
So talking about driving, did you drive down Lombard Street?
Yes, we've driven down Lombard Street a few times, and you'll probably recall from the book, we finished in San Francisco, and this was in around about June, July of 2020. California was fairly locked down, and certainly there was nobody on the streets, and we went to so Lombard Street is it's a very strange street, which sort of zigzags. It goes down a hill and it zigzags, and normally there's a massive line of traffic. You've got to wait an hour or so just to get onto the road. Well, when we went there, no one else was in San Francisco, and everyone who was living in San Francisco was staying indoors. And we parked on Lombard Street for 45 minutes, got out the car, had a look at the terrific view. And that's something which I suspect will never be repeated again. That's a good experience.
So just to give it for the colour for listeners. So it's about 6 or 7 hairpin bends, isn't it? But more importantly, beautifully decorated with flowers all the way around, isn't it? It's set down. So it's definitely worth seeing.
They're stunning houses. I'd never really noticed the houses there before because you're so busy, going around these hairpin bends.
Corner.
Yeah. So and then that was the first time I noticed it actually, and the people who live there must be delighted that they had a period of quiet, without too many people driving down that road. I think there are some other things as well. The Castro. Did you go there?
No, I don't think we did.
Kind of the LGBTQ plus community area. And it's a really good idea to do something like a walking tour there. So you can get the history of that community within San Francisco. I think that's where the film Milk was set. That is a good experience, or certainly I enjoyed that experience. And there are some other areas as well. The Presidio, which is kind of it's fairly near the Golden Gate Bridge. If there's no fog, you get a great view of the Golden Gate Bridge. That is a fort and park area. And it's also got the Walt Disney Museum there. It's fairly famed for its Chinatown. And then it's got some other great communities like the Mission and North Beach. North Beach, obviously famous for the fact it doesn't have a beach. Yeah, I think there are plenty of things to do in San Francisco. I think you're right. It probably isn't the number one sort of tourist destination in the US. I think most people would find something there which they enjoyed. Is there anything you didn't like in San Francisco?
Other than when it was cold, no. A couple of other things, Julian. Did you go to the Museum of Modern Art?
Yes.
So how would you rate? I know you like museums and you give them scores. How would you rate that? I did go, but I say I can't now recall sort of much of what I saw. So that may be it wasn't that good. What did you think?
Well, I think sometimes the museums of modern art, because usually they have a permanent collection and they also have an exhibition. And sometimes with modern art, the exhibitions are a little bit hit and miss. So when I went, I actually can no longer remember what the exhibition was. And I think the permanent connection, along with a lot of modern art museums in the US, was not that memorable for me either. So, yes, I have been there, but I have only the sort of vaguest of memories of it. Perhaps I'll give it, if I go again, perhaps I'll give it another go and report back.
So we're not recommending that. Now, when myself and my wife go places, we're much more touristy than you are, Julian, so we don't go for culture. Yeah. She was very keen to go, wait for it, to Giardelli's, the ice cream and chocolate factory.
Yeah.
And I gather that's now a sort of a mall tart bit, but that's definitely, if you want good ice cream and you want to be able to sit out on a nice afternoon and eat it, that's definitely recommended.
Okay, yes, I haven't done that. So the only sort of negative thing I would say about San Francisco, and I understand one of the things about COVID is that the problem has been, well, I don't want to say dealt with, but the problem has been alleviated slightly. It does have a fairly sizable homeless community. And because San Francisco is a fairly small place, it is impossible to miss if you go to visit San Francisco. Time before the last that I went to San Francisco, I was really appalled at the high level of homelessness. You really literally could not walk on some sidewalks because they were covered with homeless people in sleeping bags. So that issue may have been dealt with COVID. I don't know, but it did reduce my enjoyment of the city and make me less keen on it.
I think for visitors who's not been to the US, it's not an uncommon feature. In fact, I was going to say, I don't recall it being particularly bad in San Francisco, but subsequently when I went to San Diego, it was a real issue. You come out of your hotel and there's at least 5 or 6 people sleeping in sleeping bags. You're literally stepping over them to start walking. So be prepared. I don't think it's just a one city problem. I think it's in most major cities, you will see a level of homelessness you don't see in the UK.
Obviously, I've been to most of the US cities, and my perception is that most cities it's very localized, but in San Francisco it's fairly pervasive. At least it was, a couple of years ago before COVID happened. So I'm hoping that they can try and resolve that issue. I still am, very positive on San Francisco.
It's also quite expensive, though, Julian, isn't it? I mean, I think it's not an inexpensive place. So, again, if you're going on a limited budget or you want, there are far cheaper cities to go to than San Francisco.
First time we went there, when we ourselves had a very limited amount of money that we could spend, I think we stayed in Oakland and then just took the train in. So I think there are ways of reducing the cost. Silicon Valley, which is just outside San Francisco, the wealth that's been created by those industries has had quite a big effect on the cost of living in San Francisco. There are a lot of films being set in San Francisco, aren't there, Michael?
There are. And you're going to ask me which ones?
Probably of the era of you saw the Dirty Harry films.
Oh, well, I was going to say that was the one you've tried. Dirty Harry, I know, was set in San Francisco. What about Steve McQueen's Bullet? Was that San Francisco?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That also was set in, and you get the great sort of car chases in both of those types of movies with the cars, because it's so hilly. You've got the cars jumping over the hill and in midair, and with the wheels spinning, but not connected with the pavement.
So I got two. Which ones wouldn't I have got, Julian? Your favourite one, San Francisco?
Well, there was a Robin Williams film where he dresses as a woman.
Oh,
Mrs.
right,
Doubtfire.
Yes,
Mrs. Doubtfire, that's set in San Francisco. Obviously, we got the various films set around Alcatraz, so Escape from Alcatraz and The Rock. If you go back a little bit further, to your youth, you got Vertigo, the Hitchcock film, which is set partly in San Francisco and then partly just north of San Francisco. And then more recently, you've got Milk, which is the film about the local politician from the Castro. You've got Fruitville Station, which I enjoyed very much, which I think actually is set a little bit more in Oakland, but that's a more modern film. Barbra Streisand's What's Up, Doc? So there are plenty of films set in that area. It's probably quite an expensive place to film, but I think it's cinematically probably quite engaging place to set a film. On to the all-important mark, then.
Am I allowed to use my Premiership marking scoring system or the numerical one that you prefer?
Well, we do have to have a numerical one because that's the consistent one, but you can have another one of your choice.
So I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5.
Okay.
It's not quite in the top 4, but in the Premiership it could be an Arsenal. It could vying to get into the top 4.
Well, very unlikely to get in the top 4, but every year there's hope.
Yeah. So if I was making a comparison, Julian, I preferred it to LA. I find LA, too big, too sprawling, spend too much in cars, whereas I go back to it's a place you can walk around to.
I mean, I shared some of your views on LA. I really enjoy all of the things I do in LA, but I don't enjoy the place that much. But the things you do there are great. I think San Francisco, I'm going to give it 5 out of 5, actually, because there's no other place like it.
And to compare and contrast, so you could stay in the centre of San Francisco, and that would be a good base. If I go back to LA, I think you probably need 2 or 3 bases, because it's always so far to travel. So that's why I quite like it. That if you want 2 or 3 days in central base, you can see most of San Francisco from that place.
Yeah, and you certainly don't need a car. A car is a disadvantage in San Francisco. Averaging those 2 marks, it's a 4.5. We're strongly recommending San Francisco as a place to go.
So, Julian, we said we're going to talk about tipping. So, am I allowed a rant?
Yeah, you are allowed a rant.
The first thing people visiting need to know is mandatory, i.e. it comes in with the bill. And worse, there are 3 levels. And, so it's not discretionary. They will show you 3 different levels of like 10%, 12.5% or 15%, or maybe even higher. And it's taken as very bad form if you don't tip. Coming from a school where I would like to tip because I get good service, having to tip and being pointed in the right direction as to what I should tip, I don't like. What do you think, Julian?
I blame the British, because the British are the people who introduced tipping. So America didn't used to have tipping. And in the mid-19th century, or, just after the Civil War, certainly, what happened is that this British trend of tipping for service became something which then happened in America. So the wealthy people in the US started following the fashions of the wealthy British. And that's where tipping comes from in the US. If you're looking to someone to blame, the British are to blame for where we are in America.
But was it discretionary tipping? It's the fact that every time you get a bill, there's these 3 levels of calculation as to what you should pay, you should give them.
I'm very confused about tipping, and certainly when I came to live here, I was very confused. And I started talking to Americans about what you should do on tipping. And what I found is that almost nobody knew what the rules were. They were very uncertain. So I looked at a website and it said, if you have okay service, it's 10%. If it's good service, it's 15%. If it's great service, it's 18%. And if it's excellent service, 20% or more. But actually now when you get a bill, there's kind of an either automated or there's a suggested, and it always starts at 18%. So if you want to tip 18%, this is how much your tip should be. If you want to tip 22%, this is what your tip should be. So I don't really like that. However, people in the service industry do not get paid well. In fact, there's a lower minimum wage for people in the service industry than for other people. So I think they can get paid something, I can't remember the exact sum, maybe $3 an hour, because it's expected that they will get tips. So you know that if you don't tip, they're going to struggle to pay their various different bills. I'm always very confused on what it is you have to tip for. And I think most Americans are. So obviously, if you're in a restaurant or you're in a bar, you should tip. But if you get takeout or takeaway, as the British would say, then historically you haven't tipped because it's you yourself who's performing that function. You're going to collect the meal, therefore you should be tipping yourself because you've done the service. Similarly, if you're driving through, you normally don't tip. However, I've noticed during the pandemic that there's this big trend now to pay people for you picking up your own takeout and for people presenting you with the bill and the suggested tip, even though it's you yourself who's made the effort to go and pick up your lunch. And all sorts of other things. If you go for a day's fishing, how much do you tip your fish captain? So there's a whole range of things which I myself are not certain. And whenever I ask almost every American, they're not certain of the situations where you should tip. So there's a bit of confusion. Daughter number 1 and daughter number 2 have both worked in the service industries, and they get very good tips from some people. So it is not that unusual for somebody to tip daughter number 1 maybe $50 or $100, for her serving drinks. It can be very lucrative, and that is obviously well beyond any guidelines. That's somebody just saying, thank you for your service, and I want to give you, this as a reward for that. I went onto this website, which then gave the guidelines, and I'd like to share some of these guidelines with you. If you go to get some food at a restaurant, then I would say you should probably tip 20% of the total before tax, and that should be your tip at a restaurant. And if the service isn't so good, it should be 15%.
And does that include the alcohol?
That does include the alcohol.
Okay, yeah.
In fact, last night, my wife and I went out to a restaurant and she ordered a couple of glasses of very expensive wine. And I was very much begrudging the amount of tip I would have to pay on that already very expensive wine. It includes the whole bill, but not the tax on the bill.
Yeah, do that.
If you do a tour, then the typical tipping amount should be 10% of the cost of the tour. If you get something from a hotel, like somebody takes your luggage upstairs, then that would be normally $5 that you pay. Room service may be a similar amount. You should probably leave your housekeeper $5 or so for cleaning your room. If you're in a bar, you should probably add a couple of bucks per $2 to $5 per round, depending on how big the round is. And then if you go to a spa, then the typical amount is 18%. Until I went and looked that up on a website, I didn't really know it, and most Americans are rather confused about the rules as well.
So going back to my rant, it doesn't seem today related to service. It seems to be sort of an additional add-on. Now, the thing I'm going to point out is that when I go out with my wife, I then come under very significant pressure. I'm thinking, well, it's only been okay service, it's not been very good service, therefore we'll pay the lower amount. And she looks at me and I go, under the most pressure, well, I'm not sure we should, we don't want to be seen as people who pay the lowest amount. And I have to expect, well, no, the service wasn't great, so I'm paying the bare minimum. So again, there's this creeping, and you've already identified that the bill is spitting out to you at the higher amount, not the lower amount.
An acquaintance of my wife had a meal and left a fairly small tip along with the meal. As they were leaving the restaurant, the waiter ran up to them and gave them back the tip and said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, you obviously need this money more than me."
Don't tell that story to Joan, otherwise we'll always be tipping heavy. And of course, the other thing, slightly maybe a different topic, Julian, but related to service in restaurants, is the Americans' ability to take food away. So I wouldn't want to take food away and not give them a good tip, because frankly, that is playing with fire.
It depends how they do it. For our British listeners, one of the things which often happens at American restaurants is that they give very large portion sizes, more than most people could realistically eat in one sitting. Typically, you go out for a meal, you have some food, you eat half of it, and then you save half of it for the next day when you're in your home. Your concern is that they will do something to the food if you've left a small tip. Quite often, they themselves bring you the boxes, and either they or you put the food into those boxes. So that's the normal thing here. So I wouldn't worry too much about your food being doctored from a small tip.
My other question is, and this may be a UK thing, that once we brought in minimum wage in the UK, there's a big hoo-ha with several restaurants where the employees didn't get their tip. Or actually, what the organisation started doing is using tips to top up to the minimum wage. In the US, does the server always get the tip?
Each restaurant will have its own policy as to whether those tips are shared amongst a wider group of staff, or whether they're just given to the person who's offered the service. But yes, they would always go to the employees. They wouldn't be retained by the restaurant itself.
Which leads me on to my next piece around hotels. Because it's very obvious, yes, you tip the bellboy or the guy who takes your car, or delivers your luggage. But of course, when you said like the housekeeper, it's not easy to do because you might not see the same person or might not even see the person. And yet, if you want to show good service, how do you reward all the people in the background who are key to that good service?
I guess you could seek them out. You could, depending on what type of restaurant you were in, you could say, hey, I'd like to, give a small tip to the people who don't normally get tips. You could do that if you wish, and probably most good restaurants would do that. The one thing I would say about American restaurants is that service is really uniformly excellent. In Britain, if you go out for a meal, sometimes you get good service and sometimes you don't, depending on the local culture within that restaurant. In America, 99% of the time you're going to get excellent service. And of course, that part of that reason is, they're looking for a good tip. I very rarely have had bad service in a US restaurant.
Yeah, I challenge you. I don't think it's 99. I think I'm particularly going back to the previous episode you gave me, where you've got these chains of restaurants where people are trained to do certain things. Hi, have a good day, and I'm Charlene, your server.
Yes.
They're giving you a certain thing they've told to say, but it doesn't necessarily improve the service. And Cracker Barrel was the case. Service was terrible. But on the other hand, when you do get good service, you should recognise it. And you're right to say in the UK, I don't think we even value good service. So it's the exception to the rule. And therefore, when people do tip in the UK, I think the vast majority of people don't tip. They'll go to restaurants not to. So you need to understand when you go to the States, tipping this is what we do here.
People in the UK, they get a higher basic wage Whereas in the US, there's no person in a restaurant setting who could survive on their base wage. So they rely on tips. The simple rule is just add 18% to your bill.
Before tax. Before tax,
yeah. Before tax, add that on, and then that's you're not going to make any terrible mistakes.
And for those mathematically challenged, have your calculator with you.
Well, just be a bit more. If you're mathematically challenged, the penalty for that is you add 20%, which is easier to calculate.
So one further question is: should you leave cash or should you add it to the bill? Because again, in the UK, you often ask the question, "Are you going to get this?" And if they look at you in a way, "I'd rather take the money," you give them cash. What's the etiquette in the States there, Julian?
The States has a very, very high credit card payment rate, much higher than Britain. There are relatively few people who even carry cash. So I think most would pay by credit card and they add it. I know that daughter number one's workplace, the servers get all of the money, which is given to them tips, but it arrives differently depending on whether it was a cash tip or a credit card tip.
But going back to, if you're going into a hotel, you have to have cash with you because the guy taking your luggage to the room will expect a tip. And in today's cashless society, that's becoming increasingly difficult. So again, if you're going to the States, always take some cash with you, because whether it's in the taxi or whether it's in the hotel, you'll be required to give a tip to somebody very quickly.
Yeah, so tipping, are you feeling any more comfortable with it? Or
No.
In the late 19th century, there was a very strong anti-tipping society of America that tried to discourage this British practice, but they weren't successful.
Yeah, well, like a lot of things British, not successful. I don't want the listeners to think I'm a cheapskate. I think you should absolutely tip good service, but I rail against service which is the norm. A little bit like, I think you agree with me slightly. You don't like tipping for takeaways, because you've done the work, so to speak.
And historically, very few people have tipped for takeaways.
So, Julian, that concludes episode 19. Rather a short one, but hopefully useful for those thinking of visiting both San Francisco and those who are visiting the States generally, because now you know what tipping etiquette is. As always, we welcome feedback and reviews. I'm very sorry, Sharon, that you felt quite nauseous listening to episode 18. Now, I, like you, was a little certainly confused, as I said at the start of it. There was a lot of suggestions, and a crack house and crack a barrel were definitely not two things I will follow up on. In episode 20, a change from our usual format, because Julian has become our roving mic man, and he's interviewing Mandy Urenia. I hope I've said that right.
No, you haven't. No.
Urenia?
That's the one. Yeah, that's
Urenia.
the one.
Okay, sorry, Mandy. She's a British author, but now an American resident, and the book is If These Hands Could Talk. Julian, do you want to say anything about what's coming from that session?
Yeah, well, actually, I've already done the interview, and she's written a memoir about her travels around the world. She's a massage therapist, and she's written a memoir about those experiences. And we talk about all things American in our interview.
Excellent.
So that probably will be out, next week.
Until our next session, will be episode 21. For me, it's goodbye, but you'll see Julian on episode 20. Say goodbye, Julian.
Goodbye, Julian.
Goodbye, Julian. Bye. How do you pronounce Mandy's surname? Urena?
Urenia.
Urenia. Urenia, thank you. Urenia, thank you. Urenia, thank you.